Kate, how much did you inherit? Mark's voice cut through the heavy silence of the night. Your dad was loaded. I need to know what you got. The words felt like slaps in the face. I looked at my husband, searching for any sign that this was some misguided attempt to comfort me. But his eyes were cold, calculating. Tonight of all nights, my father's funeral, and this is where his mind was? Nothing, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. There wasn't anything left by the time the medical bills were paid. Mark's lip curled into a sneer. Really? Is that the story you're sticking with? I stood my ground. Yes, it is. He scoffed and turned away, mumbling something about how incompetent my brother Mike must have been in handling everything. I could feel the unease settle deep in my gut. Mark's true intentions were becoming clear, and they weren't pretty. I moved to the kitchen, needing a moment away from his probing eyes. I started the kettle, hoping a cup of tea might soothe my nerves, but the quiet clinking of the spoon in my mug did nothing to drown out the alarming thoughts racing through my head. Mark's voice reached me even from the other room. I need a drink, he grumbled, the sound of him rummaging through the liquor cabinet, loud and grating. How had I missed these signs? Or had I just ignored them, hoping things would magically get better? He walked into the kitchen, glass of whiskey in hand. You know, I thought marrying you meant a step up in the world, he said bluntly. But apparently I was wrong. I didn't reply. Words felt useless against his blatant greed. I just stared into my tea, feeling more alone than ever. After a tense silence, he finally left the room. I heard the TV flicker on, blaring some mindless show. I clenched my fists around the mug. This was the moment, right now, where everything broke open. I couldn't ignore who he was anymore, and I certainly couldn't let him have any power over my future. I decided to keep a closer watch on him. It was clear now that I couldn't trust him, that whatever affection we once shared had withered away, replaced by his hunger for wealth and status. A few days later, I received a call from my mother, Paula. She didn't offer condolences or ask how I was doing, just launched into complaints about sorting out Dad's affairs. Typical. She always favored Mike, and I was used to being the afterthought. Kate, I need you to help with the house, she droned. Sure, Mom, I replied mechanically. I'll be over tomorrow. Bring Mark, she added. We could use a man's help. I felt my frustration spike, but kept my voice even. Mark's busy. It'll just be me. The call ended abruptly, and I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear long after she hung up. Mark breezed into the room just then, sipping another whiskey. Spout, pack your things, I said suddenly. He looked at me, puzzled. What for? We're going to Mom's tomorrow. She needs help with Dad's stuff. He scowled. Are you serious? I have better things to do. You're coming, I replied firmly, our eyes locking in a silent battle. Eventually, he shrugged and walked away. That night, as I lay in bed, I listened to his soft snores and felt a pit of fear and determination grow within me. This facade was crumbling, and soon everything would come to light. It was time to brace myself for the storm. I pulled up to the old family home, a sense of dread settling over me. Mark sat in the passenger seat, tapping his fingers impatiently on the dashboard. Let's get this over with, he muttered as he climbed out of the car. As we walked up the path, memories flooded back. The house looked the same, yet everything felt different. The door swung open, and there was Paula, her face a mix of annoyance and impatience. It's about time, she snapped. I've been dealing with everything on my own. I stepped inside, brushing past her coldness. Mom, this is Mark, I introduced, though she'd met him briefly at the funeral. Paula glanced at him and nodded curtly before turning her back on us. Mike's in the study, going through paperwork. You two can start in there. I followed her voice to the study, the room an organized mess of papers, file cabinets, and old mementos. Mike barely looked up as we entered. Seeing him again was like running into a brick wall. His smirk was as smug as ever. Hey, big sis, he scoffed. Finally showed up to pitch in? You might say that, I replied tersely. Let's just get through this, all right? Mark hovered by the bookshelf, shifting his weight and looking uncomfortable. Paula's voice echoed from the hallway, giving orders like a drill sergeant. I rolled up my sleeves and dipped into the dreariness of sorting through years of memories and documents. Hours passed, the air thick with unspoken tension and strained small talk. Mark wandered out, leaving me to fend for myself with Paula and Mike. This is pointless, Mike grumbled, tossing another stack of papers aside. Dad should have taken better care of this stuff. Maybe if you'd helped him once in a while. I let the words trail off, biting back more I wanted to say, but Mike just ignored me, pulling out another drawer, searching for something of value. Just then Paula stormed in. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said, her tone dripping with irritation. "Why are you two still in here? There's more to do in the garage." We moved to the garage, and I got hit by another wave of nostalgia mixed with frustration. Old boxes of Christmas decorations, tools my dad barely used, and a neglected bike Mike rode once before, demanding a new one. Mark had reappeared, leaning against the car and scrolling through his phone. I could sense his growing irritation. He wasn't here to help. He was here to gain. While I rummaged around, Paula fixed me with a hard look. "You know," she started, "your brother was always the responsible one. Your father and I could depend on him." My grip tightened on an old photo album. "Is that so?" "Yes," she snapped, clearly relishing the criticism. "Unlike you, running off when things got tough." I felt my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to breathe deeply. No point in arguing now. I glanced at Mark, who seemed to be barely masking his impatience. For the first time, I felt a flicker of anger at him, not just for his greed, but for what I now saw as a willful blindness to the person I had become. Eventually, exhausted and angry, we decided to call it a day. Mike and Paula stayed behind, and Mark and I drove home in silence. When we got there, Mark finally spoke. "Your family's something else, you know," he said, almost as if admiring them. "Tell me about it," I mumbled, feeling drained. As I shut the door behind us, I already knew this wasn't the end. Things were just beginning to unravel, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. The storm was coming, and this time I wouldn't be caught off guard. I met Mark when I was just getting by at a dull office job. It wasn't much, but it was steady, unlike my up-and-down family life. Mark walked into the office one day, suave and confident. He made me laugh during our coffee breaks, and soon enough we were dating. I thought he was my escape. One evening, I decided to take him to meet my family, hoping for some strange reason they'd approve. We drove to my old neighborhood, my anxiety growing with each mile. When we arrived, the door swung open, and there was my mother. "Who's this, then?" Paula asked, eyeing Mark up and down like he was another project to criticize. "It's Mark," I said, pushing down my nerves. "My husband." Paula's eyebrow arched. "Oh, finally snagged someone, did you?" Mark put his arm around me, trying to lighten the mood. "Nice to meet you, Paula. Kate's told me so much about you." She ignored his outstretched hand, focusing instead on who really mattered to her. "Come inside," she said curtly, turning toward the living room. Mike lounged on the couch, flipping through TV channels, not even bothering to look up. "Sup?" he muttered, finally glancing our way. I took a deep breath. "Mark, this is Mike, my brother." "Hey," Mark offered, but Mike just nodded, turning back to the screen. It hurt seeing how little they'd changed. Paula and Mike centered around their own little world. At dinner, the tension thickened with every passing minute. Paula gushed over Mike's recent promotion, never asking about my life or my job. I could see Mark trying to keep up, looking uncomfortable. "So, what do you do, Mark?" Mike asked suddenly, not out of interest but as a challenge. "I'm an investment consultant," he replied. Mike smirked. "Guess that pays the bills, huh?" "It does," Mark said flatly, his patience wearing thin. The real blow came later when I found my father seated alone in his study. He looked so different, frail and tired, with his breathing labored. It broke my heart. He'd been a distant but kind presence in my chaotic childhood, working tirelessly to provide for us. "Hey, Dad," I said softly, his eyes lighting up slightly at the sound of my voice. "Kate, you're here," he rasped, a weak smile appearing. We talked quietly, catching up on lost time. He confided in me, telling me how hard it had been to manage things lately, how disappointed he was in how Paula and Mike were handling everything. He looked pained, not just physically but emotionally. "I'm sorry, Kate," he whispered. "I wish I could have done more for you." I squeezed his hand. "It's okay, Dad. You did what you could." Leaving the room, my chest tightened. Mark was in the kitchen, watching the interaction between Paula and Mike, his face unreadable. "It's a mess," he whispered as we walked out. "Your family, I mean." "I know," I whispered back, my voice barely holding together. This visit had reminded me why I left. The toxic dynamic between my mother and brother, their constant need to belittle me, to treat me as an afterthought. Later that night, as we drove home in silence, I made a promise to myself. I would be there for my dad, but I wouldn't be used by anyone again. Not by Paula, not by Mike, and certainly not by Mark. A week after that unsettling visit, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was tense. "Your father's getting worse, Kate," she said. "We need help." I knew this day would come. "I'll come over today," I replied, already dreading the interaction that lay ahead. I drove to the house, my mind weighing heavy with the mix of obligation and resentment. Mark didn't come this time, claiming he had a meeting. Might have been true, but I doubted it. Paula met me at the door, her face stern. "He's in his room," she said without a hint of gratitude. "And don't touch the things in the living room. Mike's sorting through some important stuff." I nodded and walked towards my father's room. Dad was propped up in bed, looking frailer than ever. His eyes met mine, a weary smile forming. "Kate, good to see you," he said, his voice a whisper. "I'm here to help, Dad," I replied, taking his hand. Over the next few days, I fell into a routine of caring for him, administering his medication, making sure he was comfortable, and speaking softly to ease his pain. Paula and Mike mostly stayed in the background, with their true colors showing through their absence. One evening, I overheard a heated conversation in the living room. Paula's voice was shrill. "We need more money, Mike. Your father's hospital bills are eating up everything." "We can't sell the house yet," Mike replied. "People would talk." I paused outside the door, my anger simmering. They were already planning how to cash in, even as Dad lay dying in the next room. I entered the room, making no effort to hide my presence. "Is this really the time to be talking about money?" I snapped. Paula glared at me. "Don't you start. You disappeared for years while we dealt with everything." "Dealt with everything?" I echoed incredulously. "Is that what you call living off Dad while he worked himself into the ground?" Mike stood up, his eyes cold. "You have no idea what it's been like. You left." "And I had every reason to leave," I shot back. Paula folded her arms. "We'll see how long you last this time." That night, I sat by my father, listening to his labored breaths. He opened his eyes and looked at me, sadness mingled with relief. "Kate, I'm so sorry for everything." My chest tightened. "Dad, you don't have to apologize." He shook his head weakly. "I wasn't there for you. Should have protected you from them." I couldn't hold back the tears. "I'm here now." The following morning, I found Paula rifling through his drawer. I stood in the doorway, my voice cold as ice. "What are you doing?" She looked up, startled. "Just organizing his things." "Sure," I said, my tone flat. "Because you've always been so organized, right?" She slammed the drawer shut. "Don't you dare judge me." "I'm not judging, I'm observing," I replied, moving to sit by my father, who had just woken up. The days dragged on with the same routine, the house thick with tension. Mike occasionally showed his face, usually to complain about something or another. I stayed focused, doing what I could for Dad. One evening, Dad's eyes sought mine with a seriousness I hadn't seen in a while. "There's a bank account," he whispered. My heart skipped a beat. "Bank account?" He nodded, struggling for breath. "Not much, but it's yours. Secret. Use it wisely, Kate." Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized the weight of his words. He'd done what he could to ensure I had something, a small act of protection amidst the chaos. I squeezed his hand, promising myself I would make it count. Knowing what I now did, I felt a flicker of hope and determination. My father's efforts wouldn't be in vain. I wouldn't let Paula, Mike, or even Mark control my fate any longer. This was just the beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. The call came just after midnight. I had been tossing and turning in bed, my mind restless, when the phone rang, cutting through the silence. "It's your father." Paula's voice was clipped, devoid of emotion. "He's been taken to the hospital." I scrambled out of bed, barely replying as I threw on some clothes and grabbed my keys. By the time I reached the hospital, my heart was pounding with dread. I found Paula and Mike in the waiting area, looking annoyed rather than distressed. "The doctors are with him," Paula said brusquely. "We've been waiting for hours." I didn't bother to respond. Rushing past them, I found the room where Dad lay, surrounded by machines and tubes. He looked impossibly weak, barely recognizing me as I stepped closer. "Kate," he murmured. "I'm here, Dad," I whispered, clutching his hand. His grip was feeble but urgent. "Remember, the account. It's for you." "I know." I said, fighting back tears. I'll take care of it. Moments later, his breathing grew shallow. The monitors beeped frantically and nurses rushed in. I was gently but firmly pushed out of the room. Paula and Mike stood in the hallway, waiting as if they were bored. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor emerged, his face solemn. "I'm sorry," he said. "He didn't make it." Paula's face hardened, betraying nothing. Mike sighed, as if inconvenienced. I fought to keep my composure, feeling a mix of grief and rage. They didn't even care. Back at the house, it didn't take long for tensions to explode. As I gathered some of Dad's belongings, Mike cornered me in the hallway. "What's this about a secret account?" he demanded. I stared at him, anger flaring. "None of your business." He stepped closer, his face contorted with a smirk. "I know he said something to you. You think you're getting away with it?" Paula appeared behind him, arms crossed. "Don't hold out on us, Kate. Whatever your father left, it's family property." "Don't you dare," I snapped, my voice shaking with incredulity. "You two leeched off him your whole lives. This is mine." Mike lunged, grabbing my arm. "You're not taking anything, you ungrateful." I yanked free, my temper boiling over. "Get your hands off me!" Mark chose that moment to stroll in, smirking as he took in the scene. "What's all this commotion?" "Kate thinks she's entitled to Dad's secret stash," Mike sneered. "Secret stash?" Mark's eyes lit up greedily. Fed up, I turned to leave, but Paula blocked my path. "You're not going anywhere," she spat. "Not until you tell us where that money is." "Over my dead body," I hissed, pushing past them. I stormed out, my heart racing. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about standing up to them, about breaking free from their grasp. I knew what I had to do, and I wasn't going to back down. That night, I sat in my apartment, clutching the small bank booklet Dad had given me. The modest sum was enough to start fresh, to carve out a new path for myself. Their selfishness and greed had pushed me too far. I wasn't the same naive girl they could push around. They were about to learn the hard way that I wasn't someone to mess with. From here on out, I would take control of my life. Their time of exploiting everything and everyone was over. The first steps of my plan were clear. The storm was here, and I was ready to face it head-on. I returned to my apartment, the weight of my father's funeral still hanging heavily over me. I barely had time to process my own grief before Mark cornered me in the kitchen. "Kate," he started, his eyes hard with impatience, "we need to talk about the inheritance again." I felt a surge of anger. "We've been over this. There's nothing significant." His face twisted with frustration. "Stop lying." "I overheard Mike talking about a secret account. Your dad must have left something worth hiding." I glared at him, feeling my blood boil. "And what if he did?" "It's none of your business." "None of my business," he scoffed, stepping closer. "I'm your husband. Whatever you have, I have a right to it too." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I didn't marry you so you could pocket my family's money, Mark." His eyes narrowed. "You're being ridiculous. Besides, there's something else you should know." I crossed my arms. "What now?" Mark hesitated for a split second before dropping the bombshell. "I've been seeing someone else." The room seemed to spin for a moment. I steadied myself against the counter. "What?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Lana," he said matter-of-factly. "Mike's girlfriend. We've been seeing each other for months." Suddenly everything fell into place. His aloofness, the constant pressure about the inheritance, it all made sense. He had been planning this all along. You vile?" I started, but he cut me off. "And that's not all," he continued, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a set of papers. "I want a divorce. Sign these." I stared at the divorce papers he placed on the counter, feeling a strange mix of anger and calm. Somehow his betrayal was almost a relief. It was the final confirmation that I needed to break free from him. I grabbed a pen and started signing. He watched me, clearly expecting more of a fight, but I was done. Finished. As I handed the papers back, I felt a sense of liberation. "Fine," I said, my voice steady. "Good riddance." A moment of silence passed, then Mark's smugness reappeared. "Hope you and your so-called inheritance are very happy." Just then, he walked out the door, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I sat down, breathing deeply, taking in the newfound sense of freedom. Mark was out of my life, and I couldn't be happier. The days that followed felt strangely bright despite the chaos. Mark had moved in with Lana, his dreams of wealth tied to her. Meanwhile, I used my father's modest inheritance to start planning for my future. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to rebuild. A couple of weeks later, the phone rang. It was Mike. "We need to talk," he said bluntly. "What now?" I replied, tired of their antics. "Mark," he spat out. "He moved in with Lana, thinking her family has money. They don't." I couldn't help but laugh. "Just desserts." "Good luck dealing with him," I said. "Not my problem anymore." "You're going to regret this," he hissed before hanging up. I leaned against the wall, feeling a small but satisfying victory. Mark's arrogance had led him right into a trap of his own making. As for me, I had a fresh slate and endless possibilities before me. Let them scheme and plot. I had learned the hard way how to stand up for myself, and nothing they did could take that away from me. I was finally free, ready to live life on my terms. The storm had come and gone, leaving me stronger and more determined than ever. And I wasn't done yet. I had plans, and nothing was going to stop me now. Mark's arrogant assumption that Lana's family had money proved to be his downfall. Within weeks, he was calling incessantly. At first, I ignored him, savoring the peace. One evening, the phone rang once more. I sighed and picked it up. "Hello?" "Kate, we need to talk." Mark's voice was desperate, a far cry from his usual arrogance. "Why? So you can try to worm your way back into my life?" I replied, my tone icy. "It's not like that," he pleaded. "Lana's family found out about us. They threw me out." I stifled a laugh, though I felt a tiny sense of satisfaction. "Not my problem," I said simply. "Kate, please," he continued, his voice wavering. "I made a mistake. We can fix this." I paused for a moment, savoring the irony. "You mean you finally realized what you had?" "Yes," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "I've been an idiot." "Well, I'm glad you admit it," I replied coolly. "But it's too late. You made your bed, Mark. Now lie in it." The silence stretched out between us, heavy and final. "Is that it, then?" he asked, his voice breaking. "That's it," I confirmed and hung up the phone. In the weeks that followed, I heard through the grapevine that Mark had been couch surfing, desperate and out of options. Mike had quickly distanced himself, blaming Mark for everything that went wrong and conveniently forgetting his own role in the mess. For once, I felt in control. I moved forward with my life, securing a small but significant freelance business. The inheritance my father left me became the seed money I needed. I poured my focus and determination into work, savoring the freedom and independence I had long craved. One crisp morning, while I was responding to client emails, the phone rang again. The caller ID showed Mike's number. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello? You think you're so smart, don't you?" Mike's voice seethed with anger. "Dad's money was supposed to be for all of us." "I earned it, Mike. You and Mom took everything else while Dad was alive," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I hope you're happy," he spat. "We're losing the house." I took a deep breath. His anger was almost palpable, but it no longer had power over me. "Maybe now you'll understand what it's like to work for something." "You'll regret this, Kate. I'll make sure of it," he snarled before hanging up abruptly. I set the phone down, feeling the weight of his threat. But instead of fear, I felt an unusual sense of calm. I had faced worse, and survived. What could Mike possibly do now? As the weeks turned into months, I flourished. My small freelance business grew, and for the first time in years, I felt grounded and secure. Every time I heard about Mike and Paula's growing financial troubles, a part of me felt vindicated. One evening, I sat in my small but cozy apartment, looking out over the city. I had come a long way, and the journey had been anything but easy. Yet, here I was, standing tall and moving forward. The ghosts of my past no longer haunted me. They were simply part of the story I had overcome. The phone rang again, but this time I didn't feel a jolt of anxiety. I picked it up calmly, ready for whatever came next. "Hello? Kate, it's Mom." She started, but I cut her off, my voice steady and firm. "I'm done, Mom. Take care of yourselves." I hung up, feeling a profound sense of closure. The storm had come and gone. I was free, strong, and finally living life on my own terms. The years rolled by quickly after I hung up on my mother. I poured everything into my freelance business, growing it from a side hustle into a thriving enterprise. The modest inheritance from Dad turned out to be more than just financial stability. It was the foundation for a new life. My new apartment, though small, felt like a palace. It was mine, a space free of the shadows of my past. I spent comfortable evenings reading by the window, the city lights dancing in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness of my earlier years. One afternoon, my phone rang. Seeing an unknown number, I almost let it go to voicemail, but then answered on a whim. Hello? Kate, this is Miss Johnson from the bank. I wanted to inform you that your mother's assets have been frozen. There's been a foreclosure on the house. I paused, taking in the information. Thank you for letting me know, I said before hanging up. A few days later, I found myself walking through an old, familiar neighborhood. The house looked the same, but there was a for sale sign on the lawn. I felt an odd mix of nostalgia and triumph. Paula and Mike's reign of exploiting Dad's hard work had come to an end. My phone buzzed again, a text this time. It was from Mike. You think you've won, don't you? This isn't over. I rolled my eyes. Grow up, Mike, I muttered, texting back a simple, move on with your life. I put the phone away and continued down the street, my steps lighter than they had been in years. Months passed, and my life continued to flourish. One chilly morning, as I was setting up a new project for a client, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Mike standing there, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. Kate, he began, desperation in his voice. I need help. I sighed, stepping outside and closing the door behind me. Mike, you've had chances, plenty of them. It's different now. We've lost everything. Mom's sick, he pleaded, his bravado gone. Look, I can't keep being your crutch. You need to stand on your own, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. We're family, he insisted. Family? I scoffed. You never acted like it. You chose to ignore Dad's wishes, and now you're paying the price. His shoulders slumped. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. You need to go, I said finally. Figure out your life. He nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. I'm sorry, Kate. I watched as he walked away, a sense of finality settling over me. It wasn't my job to fix their mess anymore. I had my life to live and my own path to follow. As weeks turned into months, I started receiving updates on Paula and Mike through old neighbors. Their lives had become a cycle of struggle and regret. Strangely, I felt no satisfaction, just a profound sense of relief that I had escaped that toxic environment. One day, while taking a break from work, I found myself heading to a small, secluded park not far from my apartment. It was a quiet place, full of large oak trees and benches. I picked one near a small pond and sat down, the cool breeze soothing. As I sat there, I felt an odd sense of closeness to my father. It was almost as if his spirit was there, watching over me. I closed my eyes, taking in the peace of the moment. I've come a long way, Dad, I whispered to the wind, feeling his presence in the rustling leaves. Opening my eyes, I looked at the world around me with a sense of accomplishment. I had fought hard for this peace, and I would cherish it. There was a future ahead, bright and full of promise, and I was ready for whatever came next.